Please help us. The little black girl begged the biker while a warning siren echoed behind the rusted doors. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. On a cool, crisp evening in a forgotten corner of a small town, a chilling scene was unfolding. The sirens wailed in the distance, echoing through the empty streets. A little black girl, no more than 10 years old, ran desperately towards the only place that might save her, the biker bar at the edge of town. Her tiny legs carried her as fast as they could, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she pushed through the rusty doors, tears streaming down her face. The bikers inside, rough and weathered from years on the road, paused in their conversations and looked up, startled by the sight of the terrified child. She was barefoot, her clothes torn and covered in dirt, and her eyes wide with fear. "Please help us," she cried, her voice trembling. "They took my brother. Please." The room fell silent as the bikers exchanged wary glances. This was no ordinary request. This was no simple plea. The girl's voice carried the weight of a desperate need, one that could not be ignored. Jack Hawk Morrison, the leader of the group, stood up slowly. His heavy boots thudded against the wooden floor as he made his way toward the girl. His mind raced. Something about this felt wrong, but his instincts told him they couldn't turn their backs on her. "Who took him?" he asked, his voice gruff but calm. The girl's small hands shook as she pointed toward the parking lot. "A man. He drove off in a silver truck. He took Jamal, my brother." Hawk felt a cold chill run down his spine. He had seen a lot in his years on the road, but this was different. The look in the girl's eyes, the sheer terror in her voice, it was a cry for help that no one could ignore. He turned to his crew. "We're going after them," he said firmly. The bikers didn't hesitate. They had all made a vow, years ago, to look out for the vulnerable and protect those who couldn't protect themselves. And when one of their own needed help, they didn't back down. "We don't know what we're walking into," Hawk warned. "But we ride as a family, and we won't leave anyone behind." Without a word, the bikers began gathering their gear, slipping on their leather jackets, adjusting their helmets, and checking their bikes. The engines roared to life, a symphony of thunder that shook the very ground beneath them. One by one, the riders lined up outside the bar, the girl still standing at the doorway, clutching Hawk's jacket tightly. "Stay close," Hawk instructed. "We'll bring your brother home." The convoy of bikes sped through the empty streets, the sound of their engines echoing in the night. The girl clung to Hawk's bike, her small hands gripping his jacket tightly. But for the first time in hours, she felt a flicker of hope. These bikers, who had always been seen as troublemakers, had just become her protectors, and they weren't going to stop until her brother was safe. The convoy of motorcycles roared down the deserted highway, cutting through the stillness of the night like a force of nature. The wind whipped past them, but no one paid attention to the chill. Their focus was on one thing, getting to the little boy, Jamal, before it was too late. Hawk led the pack, his hands steady on the handlebars, his mind racing with questions. Who was this man who had taken the girl's brother? Why was he so intent on causing harm? Was it personal, or just another case of a sick individual who thrived on fear and control? The road stretched ahead, but with every passing mile, the tension in the air grew thicker. The girl, who had been clinging to Hawk's bike, now sat behind him, her small hands gripping his jacket tightly. Hawk glanced over his shoulder at her, her tear-streaked face visible in the dim light of the motorcycle's headlamp. Her wide eyes reflected a mix of fear and hope, her silent plea for help hanging heavily in the air. "We're going to get him back," Hawk said firmly, though his own heart was heavy with the weight of the promise. The girl nodded, wiping her tears on her sleeve, but Hawk could see the faint tremor in her body. She was scared, and Hawk knew, deep down, that the worst was yet to come. They continued to speed through the dark night, the engines of their motorcycles rumbling like thunder in the distance. But the silence that followed them was only broken by the occasional crackle of the radio, the steady buzz of their communication. As they approached a small town on the outskirts of their destination, Hawk's phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't need to check it. He knew it was the call he'd been expecting. "What's the situation?" he asked as he answered, his voice steady but urgent. "They're moving him," a voice crackled back through the line. "The truck's heading toward an old warehouse just outside the industrial district. I've got eyes on it." Hawk's jaw tightened. He knew the place. It had been abandoned for years, a perfect spot for someone to hide without drawing attention. "We'll be there in 10 minutes, he replied. "Stay put. We don't want to spook them." The line went dead, and Hawk signaled to the rest of the group. "We got to move fast," he said, his voice low but commanding. "This is it. Everyone, follow my lead." The convoy picked up speed, weaving in and out of traffic as they entered the industrial district. The once bustling area was now eerily quiet, with only the occasional flicker of a street lamp casting long shadows along the empty streets. The warehouse loomed ahead, its broken windows and rusted metal doors barely visible in the dark. Hawk's heart raced as he gave the signal to stop. They pulled up to a darkened alleyway near the entrance to the warehouse, cutting their engines one by one. The silence was suffocating. Hawk felt the weight of every second ticking by. They had no time to waste. "Stay close," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the hum of the city. "We move in quick and quiet. We're not here to start a war. We're here to get that kid and get out." One by one, the bikers dismounted, their boots hitting the pavement with a soft thud. The air was thick with the scent of oil and metal, a familiar smell that Hawk had come to associate with his crew. But tonight, it felt different. Tonight, they weren't just a group of bikers. They were a family, and they were about to face something far darker than anything they had encountered before. Hawk led the way, his footsteps steady as he moved toward the warehouse doors. The others followed, their movements synchronized, each one alert to any sound or movement. Hawk reached for the door handle, his fingers brushing the cold metal. He paused for a moment, listening. There was nothing. No movement. No sounds of struggle. No shouting. Just the silence that seemed to echo in the night. He slowly turned the handle, pushing the door open just enough to slip inside. The faint glow of a single bulb flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the dusty floor. The warehouse was vast, filled with old crates and rusted machinery. But in the far corner, Hawk could see a figure. A man. He was pacing, his back to them, unaware of their presence. The girl's brother was nowhere in sight. Hawk's heart sank. "Where is he?" he muttered under his breath. The man turned suddenly, his eyes widening in surprise when he saw the bikers. He reached for something at his side, but before he could react, Hawk was already on him. A fist slammed into his jaw, sending the man stumbling backward. "You're not taking anyone else," Hawk growled, his voice filled with rage. The other bikers moved in quickly, surrounding the man. He looked around, realizing he was trapped, but still, he didn't back down. He lunged toward Hawk, a knife glinting in the dim light. But before he could reach him, another biker stepped in, knocking the knife from his hand and pinning him to the ground. "Stay down," the biker growled, his grip firm as he restrained the man. Hawk stood over him, his breath steady as he surveyed the scene. The man's defiance was clear, but Hawk wasn't going to let him get away. Not this time. "Where's the boy?" Hawk demanded, his voice cold and firm. The man glared up at him, blood dripping from his lip. But then, a voice broke through the tension. "I'm here." Hawk turned, his heart pounding as he saw the small figure step into the light. Jamal, the girl's brother, stood there, looking frightened but unharmed. Hawk's heart soared with relief. He wasn't. Too late. The boy was safe. But the danger wasn't over. Not yet. The scene inside the warehouse was tense, the quiet broken only by the sound of Jamal's shaky breath. He was standing a few feet away, his small frame trembling with fear and relief. Hawk took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions racing through him. The man they had just apprehended was sprawled on the floor, eyes filled with hatred, but Hawk's focus was entirely on the boy in front of him. "You're okay now," Hawk said softly, his voice surprisingly gentle for someone who had just been in a fight. Jamal nodded, but his eyes were wide, haunted by the experience. Hawk moved toward him, kneeling down to his level. "Are you hurt?" The boy shook his head, his voice barely a whisper as he replied, "No, but I'm scared." The vulnerability in his voice hit Hawk harder than any blow he had ever taken. This little boy had been through hell in the past few hours, and the bikers had just saved him. But Hawk knew they couldn't stop here. They had to get Jamal back to safety. With a hand on the boy's shoulder, Hawk gently led him toward the exit of the warehouse. "We're going to get you out of here," he said, giving a quick glance to the rest of his crew. "Let's move." The bikers stood firm, their bodies tense but alert, keeping a watchful eye on the man who was still on the floor. The atmosphere was thick with danger. Even though Jamal was safe for now, they couldn't let their guard down. The air outside felt cold against their skin as they moved out of the warehouse, the sound of their boots echoing in the silence. The night had grown deeper, and the stars overhead seemed to watch them as they moved toward their motorcycles. The convoy of bikers was ready to ride, but Hawk knew that getting Jamal home was only half the battle. As they reached the bikes, Hawk turned to his crew. "Get your bikes ready," he commanded. "We ride hard. We ride fast. No one stops until we're clear." One by one, the bikers mounted their bikes, the engines coming to life with a thunderous roar. Jamal climbed onto the back of Hawk's bike, his small hands gripping onto the leather jacket of the man who had become his protector. The convoy pulled out of the abandoned lot, riding through the empty streets, the sound of their motorcycles filling the night air. The city was quiet, but Hawk's mind was racing. He had promised to keep Maya and Jamal safe, and now that promise was more real than ever. "Stay close," Hawk said, his voice firm and unwavering. "We don't know who else is out there. Stick together, and we get out of this one piece." The road stretched out before them, dark and winding, but Hawk's crew was ready. They had been through worse together, and tonight was no different. But as they rode, Hawk couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just a kidnapping gone wrong. They had only scratched the surface. The boy's father had been a part of their family once. Had something changed? And why had the Serpents gotten involved? Hawk's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden flash of headlights in the distance. His eyes narrowed as he recognized the silver SUV that had been seen earlier. They weren't alone. Someone was following them. "Keep your distance," Hawk ordered into his helmet radio. "They're on our tail." The convoy increased their speed, engines roaring as they pushed forward. The feeling of being chased was all too familiar. Hawk had lived through enough high-speed chases to know how to handle it. But this wasn't just about escaping. This was about protecting Jamal, and he wasn't going to let anyone take him again. The SUV was gaining on them, its headlights blinding in the rear view. Hawk's heart raced, but his grip on the handlebars remained steady. He signaled to the rest of the crew, and they split into two groups, one moving to the left and one to the right, trying to throw off their pursuers. The chase was on. As they sped through the dark streets, Hawk couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. They were up against more than just a man in the SUV. They were up against a powerful, dangerous organization. And this was only the beginning. The road ahead seemed endless, but Hawk pushed forward, determined to keep his promise. "We don't stop until we're out of this," he muttered to himself, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engines. The convoy kept going, the night wrapping around them like a cloak, and Hawk knew that this was far from over. They had made it out of the warehouse, but the real battle was still to come. The roar of the motorcycles echoed through the night, the sound of the engines vibrating in the air as Hawk led his crew down the winding streets. Jamal clung tightly to Hawk's back, his small hands gripping the leather jacket like it was his only lifeline. The fear in the boy's eyes hadn't left him, but Hawk could sense the glimmer of hope now. The bikers had gotten him out of that warehouse, but they were far from safe. As the convoy sped through the streets, Hawk's eyes darted from side to side, watching for any signs of pursuit. The silver SUV from earlier was nowhere to be seen, but Hawk knew better than to think they were in the clear. The Serpents didn't just let things go. They would come for Jamal. The road ahead seemed endless, a dark ribbon stretching out under the headlights, and Hawk's mind raced as he processed everything. What brought the Serpents back into this? Why had Jamal been taken in the first place? Hawk's grip on the handlebars tightened as they turned onto a quiet, darkened street. The streets here were narrow, lined with abandoned buildings and dim streetlights flickering in the distance. It was the kind of place where no one bothered to ask questions. Perfect for a dangerous crew, like the Serpents, to hide in plain sight. Hawk signaled for the convoy to slow down, his sharp eyes scanning every corner. He could feel the weight of the night pressing down on him. He had promised Maya's father he would protect his children, and he wasn't about to let that promise slip away. "We need to make sure we're not being followed," Hawk muttered into his radio. The other bikers responded, their voices coming through the static. "I'll take the lead," said Diesel, the tallest member of the crew. "I've got eyes on back. You'll know if anyone is behind us." Hawk nodded, trusting Diesel's sharp instincts. The convoy slowed even more, the engines now a low rumble as they weaved through the alleyways and side streets. It wasn't long before they reached an old, crumbling building at the end of the road. It looked like a warehouse, long abandoned, the windows boarded up, the door barely hanging on its hinges. Hawk brought his bike to a stop and motioned for the others to follow. "This is it," he said. "We'll lay low here for a while. We'll wait until we know we're safe." The bikers dismounted, the heavy sound of their boots echoing in the quiet night. Hawk turned to Jamal, who had already slipped off his bike, his eyes wide with exhaustion and fear. "You okay, kid?" Hawk asked, his voice softer now. Jamal nodded, but the lines of worry on his face were clear. "I want to go home," he whispered. Hawk felt a lump form in his throat. "I know, kid," he said. "We're getting you there. Just hold on a little longer." As the bikers gathered around the building, keeping a watchful eye on their surroundings, Hawk could feel the tension in the air. Something wasn't right. They were too exposed here, and the night was too quiet. It didn't feel like a safe place. "We need to move," Hawk said, his voice low but firm. "This isn't the right place to wait. The Serpents are smart. They'll figure out we're here soon enough." Diesel nodded in agreement, his hand resting on the handle of his bike. "I'll keep watch. If anyone tries to come close, you'll know." Hawk nodded, signaling to the others. "Let's pack up. We're moving out." The bikers moved quickly, securing their gear and getting back on their bikes. Hawk felt his pulse quicken as he mounted his Harley. They couldn't stay here, not with Jamal in tow. They had to keep moving, no matter the cost. "We'll head to the outskirts of town," Hawk said, turning his bike on. "Lay low until we figure out the next step." The engines roared back to life, and the convoy set off once again, weaving through the narrow streets. Hawk's mind raced, but he kept his eyes on the road ahead. He could feel the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He had made a promise, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. As they rode through the darkened streets, Hawk glanced over at Jamal, who was now holding onto him with both hands, his face pressed against Hawk's back. The boy had been through too much, and Hawk couldn't help but feel the sting of guilt. They weren't home yet. They weren't safe yet. And Hawk knew that the real battle was only just beginning. The convoy roared down the road, the sound of their engines a steady beat in the night air. Hawk kept his eyes on the road ahead, his mind racing. They were heading out of town, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. Not with Jamal on his bike. Not until they were sure the Serpents had lost their trail. The streets blurred as they moved faster, but Hawk could feel the weight of the situation pressing in on him. They weren't just running from danger. They were racing against time. They had to get Jamal somewhere safe, but every minute felt like an eternity. The silence between the bikers was heavy. Diesel, always the quiet one, kept his eyes on the road behind them, watching for any sign of pursuit. The others kept close, riding in formation as they sped through the dark streets. Hawk could see the faint glow of the city's lights behind them, but the road ahead was still empty. The air was cool, the night sky clear, but Hawk could sense the storm brewing just beyond the horizon. As they neared the outskirts of town, Hawk's radio crackled to life. "This is Diesel. We've got company," came the low voice through the static. Hawk's heart skipped a beat. "How many?" he asked, keeping his voice steady despite the surge of adrenaline. "2 SUVs. They're not far behind, maybe 3 miles. Hawk's grip tightened on the handlebars. He had known this moment would come. The Serpents weren't going to let them go that easily. "Stay sharp," Hawk ordered into his radio. "We keep moving, no matter what." The convoy pushed forward, their bikes eating up the miles as they left the city behind. The road opened up in front of them, long stretches of highway, now stretching into the darkness. Jamal, still clinging to Hawk's back, looked over his shoulder nervously, his small face pale in the dim light. Hawk could feel the boy's fear, and it only made him push harder. They couldn't let those SUVs catch up. Not now. Not when they were so close to safety. "Don't look back," Hawk said to Jamal, his voice low but firm. "We're getting out of here. You're going to be okay." Jamal nodded, but his grip on Hawk's jacket tightened, and Hawk could feel the boy's heart racing against his back. The wind whipped past them as they sped down the road, the sound of their engines filling the air. Hawk kept glancing over his shoulder, watching the rearview mirrors, waiting for any sign of the SUVs. They had to stay ahead. "We've got to get to the next town," Hawk muttered to himself. "That's where we'll make our stand." The miles stretched on, but the tension only grew. They couldn't outrun the Serpents forever. They needed a plan. As they neared a fork in the road, Hawk made a quick decision. "We take the dirt road," he said, jerking his head to the right. "It'll slow them down." "We don't stop." The bikers veered off the main road, their tires kicking up gravel as they took the turn. The dirt road was rough, the bumps shaking the bikes as they rode through the open fields. It wasn't a smooth ride, but it was their only shot at losing the pursuers. Behind them, the sound of the SUVs grew louder, their engines roaring as they followed the bikers' path. But the dirt road was narrow, winding through thick trees and low brush, and the Serpents' vehicles had trouble keeping up. The bikers' skills on the rough terrain were unmatched. They were used to this kind of ride, used to handling their bikes through the toughest conditions. Hawk led the way, cutting through the darkened path, his headlights cutting through the trees as he focused on the road ahead. "We're losing them." Diesel's voice came through the radio. "They're falling behind." Hawk didn't slow down. "Keep moving. We're not out of the woods yet." The sound of the SUVs faded as they fell further behind, but Hawk knew it wasn't over. They had to get to safety, to the next town, where they could regroup. Hawk's mind raced, plans forming and reforming in his head. They couldn't go to a hospital. The Serpents would find them there. They needed a safe house, somewhere no one would think to look. "There's a place," Hawk said, his voice steady as he spoke into the radio. "It's about 20 miles up ahead. We make it there. We're safe." The bikers pushed on, their bikes flying down the dirt road. The headlights of the SUVs were nowhere in sight now, but Hawk knew better than to get comfortable. They weren't safe until they were out of this area entirely. The road ahead was empty, just the sound of the engines and the rush of wind. Hawk felt his muscles tense, his mind constantly on alert. As they reached the edge of the dirt road, the convoy slowed down, carefully approaching the main highway again. The last thing they needed was to attract attention now. But Hawk's eyes were always scanning, looking for any sign of movement. They had almost made it. Almost. The highway stretched out ahead of them, and Hawk felt a brief sense of relief. They had survived the chase, but the danger wasn't over. Not yet. He could still feel the weight of the boy on his back, the responsibility pressing down on him. But they were getting closer to safety. They were getting closer to the end of this nightmare. The convoy rolled into the outskirts of the town, their bikes easing onto the main road with a cautious speed. Hawk's eyes scanned the area, his nerves on edge despite the fact that the Serpents seemed to have lost their trail. The sun had started to rise, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink, but Hawk felt no relief. He knew better than to think they were out of danger. They had made it through the chase, but the real challenge was just beginning. They were miles away from the safety of their usual haunts, and they had a child to protect. As the convoy slowed, Hawk's thoughts were interrupted by the soft voice of Jamal. "Are we safe now?" the boy asked, his voice still shaky from the events that had unfolded. Hawk's heart ached as he glanced back at him. "Not yet, kid. We're almost there, though." Hawk kept his voice steady, but the truth was they weren't safe until they were behind closed doors where no one could get to them. The bikers had all taken positions on the road, scanning for any sign of trouble. Diesel had already pulled to the side of the road, keeping a watchful eye out for anything suspicious. Hawk nodded at him, signaling to the others to pull off the highway. They had reached a small, secluded area, far from the prying eyes of the main road. a perfect place to regroup and plan their next move. The engines cut off, one by one, and the bikers dismounted, their boots hitting the dirt with a soft thud. "All right, we need to lay low for a while," Hawk said as he turned to his crew. "We can't risk staying in one place too long. The Serpents will be looking for us." He looked at Jamal, who was still clinging to him. "You okay, kid?" Jamal nodded silently, but Hawk could see the exhaustion in his eyes. The boy had been through a lot in the past few hours, and Hawk couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. This wasn't the life he had wanted for him. "We'll make sure you're safe, I promise," Hawk said, giving the boy a reassuring smile. As they set up camp in the secluded area, the mood among the bikers was serious, but there was a quiet understanding between them. They weren't just a group of outlaws. They were a family, and no one was going to let anything happen to Jamal. Diesel approached Hawk, his face tense. "We've got a problem," he said quietly, glancing over his shoulder as if to make sure no one was listening. "What is it?" Hawk asked, his voice low. "The Serpents aren't the only ones looking for Jamal. There's someone else. A bigger player." Diesel's words sent a chill down Hawk's spine. The Serpents had always been dangerous, but a bigger player meant something far more serious. "Who?" Hawk asked, his tone sharp. Diesel hesitated for a moment before answering. "It's the Cartel. They've been keeping an eye on Jamal's family for a while. I think they're trying to get their hands on him for a different reason." Hawk's jaw tightened. The Cartel? That changed everything. They weren't just dealing with some local gang anymore. They were in over their heads. "We need to move," Hawk said, his mind racing. "We can't stay here. We'll make a plan, figure out what to do next." The bikers gathered around, forming a tight circle. Hawk outlined the situation, explaining what Diesel had just told him. The group was silent, absorbing the information. "We can't outrun the Cartel," one of the bikers, Phantom, said, his voice steady. "We need to outsmart them." "Agreed," Hawk replied. "We stay low, use the roads we know, and get Jamal to safety. We'll use our connections, get some help." "What about the Serpents?" Diesel asked, still looking over his shoulder. "They'll be back, no doubt," Hawk said. "But right now, the Cartel's our biggest concern. We need to find a safe place to lay low for a while, and then we figure out our next move." The bikers nodded in agreement, ready to do whatever it took. Hawk glanced at Jamal, who was standing quietly nearby, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. The boy had been thrust into a world he couldn't possibly understand, a world filled with danger and uncertainty. Hawk had promised to protect him, and he wasn't going to let him down. As they prepared to leave, Hawk gave one last look around the area. It was quiet now, but he knew that quiet wouldn't last. They had to keep moving. "Let's go," Hawk said, mounting his bike. The convoy of bikers revved their engines, the sound of their motorcycles roaring to life as they prepared to leave. The sun was fully up now, but Hawk felt no relief. They were still in danger, and the road ahead would only get harder. As they sped down the road, Hawk kept his eyes on the horizon. They had a long way to go, and the Cartel wasn't the only threat they had to worry about. But for now, all that mattered was keeping Jamal safe. And as long as they were together, Hawk knew they would fight to the end. The convoy of bikers roared down the highway, the sound of their engines reverberating through the quiet morning. Hawk's eyes remained fixed on the road ahead, his thoughts racing. He had promised to get Jamal to safety, but the weight of that promise felt heavier with each mile. The Cartel, the Serpents, each danger was bigger than the last, and Hawk knew the risks were growing. The rest of the bikers stayed close, the convoy tight as ever, but Hawk could see the tension in their faces. They were all well aware that their enemies weren't far behind. As they neared a small, secluded gas station, Hawk signaled for the convoy to slow down. The gas station was tucked away off the highway, a little place that no one paid attention to. It seemed like the perfect spot to lay low for a while, at least long enough to catch their breath and plan their next move. "Everyone check in," Hawk said through the radio. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of a leader who had to keep his crew focused despite the chaos. Diesel's voice crackled through. "We're good back here. No one's on our tail." Hawk nodded, though he didn't feel the relief he should have. Diesel was good, but Hawk had learned a long time ago not to trust silence in situations like these. "Keep your eyes peeled. We don't know what we're dealing with," Hawk replied. He pulled into the gas station first, the others following behind him in a careful, coordinated manner. As they dismounted, Jamal stepped off Hawk's bike, his eyes wide with exhaustion. He had barely said a word since they left the warehouse, and Hawk could see the toll it was taking on the boy. "You okay?" Hawk asked, trying to keep his voice gentle. Jamal nodded, but his face was pale, his eyes hollow with fear. "I want to go home," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Hawk's heart tightened. "I know, kid. We're getting there." But the truth was, Hawk didn't know how much longer they could keep running. He had thought they were safe, but there were too many threats lurking in the shadows, and Jamal's safety was still in question. He looked around the small gas station. It was quiet, but something about the stillness made Hawk uneasy. "We'll keep moving in 10 minutes, Hawk said to the crew. No time to waste. They started fueling up, checking their bikes, and taking quick stock of their supplies. Hawk took a moment to survey the area, his instincts on high alert. The cartel wasn't the only problem. If they had lost the Serpents, they would surely regroup and come after them. Hawk knew they had to keep moving. As the last of the bikes were refueled, Hawk turned to Diesel. "You check the perimeter?" Diesel nodded. "No sign of trouble. But I'll keep an eye out while we get going." Hawk nodded. "Good. Let's move out." The convoys started their bikes and made their way out of the station. The road stretched ahead, but Hawk couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't done running yet. He glanced back at Jamal, still sitting on the back of his bike, clutching the leather of Hawk's jacket like it was his lifeline. Jamal was strong, but Hawk could see the fear in his eyes. Hawk didn't know how much longer he could protect the boy, not with the cartel and the Serpents breathing down their necks. The convoy rode on, the morning light casting long shadows as they made their way down the winding roads. Hawk's mind raced. They needed to find a place to hide, somewhere the cartel wouldn't look. They needed to get Jamal out of danger, but how could they do that when it felt like every road was leading them into more trouble? "We got to figure out our next move," Hawk said into his radio. "We can't keep running forever." Phantom's voice came through the static. "We could head up north into the mountains. It's off the grid. Might give us a chance to regroup." Hawk considered the suggestion. It wasn't a bad idea. The mountains would be harder for the cartel to track them in, and it would give them time to figure out their next move. "We'll take the mountain route," Hawk decided. "Everyone get ready. We're heading north." The convoy shifted direction, making their way toward the mountain roads. The terrain would be rougher, but it was their best shot at evading their enemies. As they rode through the winding roads, the sun climbing higher in the sky, Hawk couldn't help but think of all the things they had yet to face. The cartel, the Serpents, the people who had been following them all this time. They weren't going to stop until they had what they wanted. But Hawk had made a promise. He wasn't going to let anyone get hurt, not while he still had a breath in his body. The convoy pushed on, the mountains growing nearer with each passing mile. Hawk's mind was sharp, his body tense with the anticipation of what was to come. They weren't out of danger yet, but they were still fighting, and that was what mattered. The mountains loomed ahead, their jagged peaks bathed in the soft light of the morning. The convoy of bikers moved steadily along the winding road, the engines of their motorcycles a steady hum in the cool air. Hawk kept his focus, eyes scanning the path ahead, but his mind was elsewhere on the dangers that still loomed. The road was quiet for now, but Hawk knew better than to trust silence. They had just escaped the immediate danger of the Serpents and the cartel, but it wouldn't be long before they regrouped and came after them. The mountains were their refuge for now, a temporary shelter from the storm. But Hawk had seen enough to know that safety was never guaranteed. As the convoy continued to climb higher into the mountains, Jamal shifted uncomfortably behind Hawk. The boy had been quiet for most of the ride, his arms wrapped tightly around Hawk's waist. Hawk could feel the weight of the boy's fear, the lingering anxiety of everything he had gone through. Hawk glanced over his shoulder, his eyes meeting Jamal's for a brief moment. "You holding up okay?" Hawk asked, his voice soft but firm. Jamal nodded, but his eyes betrayed him, filled with uncertainty. "I'm scared," Jamal admitted quietly. Hawk's heart tightened. The boy had every reason to be scared. He had been thrown into a nightmare, surrounded by danger and violence. But Hawk couldn't afford to let that fear show. He had to stay strong for Jamal, For the crew, for everyone. I know you are, Hawk said gently, his voice steady. But we're gonna make it through this. I'm not going anywhere. I'll make sure you're safe. Jamal clung a little tighter to Hawk, a silent promise of trust, of hope. Hawk knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew they had a chance. They had survived the first wave of threats, and they were still standing. And as long as they had each other, they would keep fighting. The convoy continued to climb higher, the road narrowing as the terrain became more rugged. The mountains had a way of making everything feel smaller, more isolated, and for a moment, Hawk allowed himself to relax just slightly. They were getting closer to the remote cabin that Diesel had mentioned, a place that could offer them some semblance of safety. But as they rounded a sharp bend, Hawk's instincts kicked in. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, a sense of unease flooding over him. Stop! Hawk barked suddenly, his voice sharp. The convoy immediately came to a halt, the sound of engines dying as the bikers followed his lead. Hawk's eyes narrowed as he scanned the road ahead. It was empty, but something didn't feel right. Stay alert, he commanded. We might not be alone. Diesel dismounted first, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. What's wrong? He asked, his voice low. Hawk didn't answer right away, his focus still trained on the road. It was too quiet. The wind howled through the trees, but there was no sign of movement, no sign of anything. And that's when Hawk noticed it. A glint of metal, half hidden in the brush by the side of the road. Over there, Hawk said, his voice low but commanding. Diesel followed his gaze, his eyes locking onto the metal object. Slowly, carefully, the two bikers moved toward it. The rest of the crew stayed on alert, ready for anything. As they approached, Diesel knelt down, his hand reaching out to touch the object. Hawk felt his heart skip a beat as he saw what it was. A trap, a metal spike camouflaged in the brush, designed to puncture tires. The Serpents had been here. They knew they were being followed. Hawk's stomach churned. They had to move, and fast. Get back to the bikes. Hawk shouted. Now! The bikers quickly followed orders, scrambling to mount their motorcycles. They couldn't afford to waste any more time. They were in enemy territory now, and every second counted. Hawk's mind raced as he kicked his bike into gear. He glanced over at Jamal, who was holding onto him tightly, his face pale with fear. It's okay, kid. We're getting out of here. But Hawk's words didn't reassure him. Jamal knew they were still in danger, and Hawk couldn't guarantee their safety. The road ahead was narrow and treacherous, winding through the dense forest. It wasn't just the terrain they had to worry about. It was the possibility of the Serpents and the Cartel lying in wait. They had no idea how many of them were out there. Hawk pushed the bike faster, the rest of the convoy following suit. The sound of their engines roared through the trees, a deafening crescendo that only served to heighten their sense of urgency. As they continued down the mountain, the dense forest closed in around them. The sunlight filtered through the thick canopy, casting long shadows on the road. Hawk's eyes darted from side to side, always looking for danger. He wasn't sure if it was the sound of their engines or the shadows in the trees, but something felt off. They had made it this far, but Hawk knew better than to think they were. Safe. He couldn't stop. Not yet. Not until they reached the cabin. And even then, Hawk had no illusion that they would be truly safe. The fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The convoy continued to ride, the weight of their pursuit heavy on their shoulders. Hawk could feel the boy's hands shaking behind him, and he knew that Jamal's fear wasn't going away. Not until they were truly safe. But for now, all they could do was ride. And ride they did. The convoy continued down the mountain road, the sound of their engines echoing in the quiet wilderness. Hawk's grip on the handlebars was tight, his knuckles white, as he maneuvered his bike through the winding path. The road ahead was still rough, with sharp turns and uneven terrain, but the real danger wasn't the road. It was what lay ahead. Hawk's mind raced with thoughts of the Serpents, the Cartel, and what they would do next. He glanced in the rearview mirror, but the road was empty behind them. For now, they were safe, but Hawk knew that peace never lasted long. He could feel Jamal's grip tightening around his waist, the boy still clinging to him as if Hawk was his last lifeline. Hawk didn't blame him. Jamal had been through hell. Hawk had promised to protect him, and he wouldn't let anything happen to the boy. The thought of failing him made his blood run cold. "You doing okay back there?" Hawk called over his shoulder, his voice low but firm. Jamal's voice came back, quiet but steady. "I'm okay. Just scared." Hawk's heart clenched. The boy was strong, but no child should ever have to face what Jamal had. "I know, kid," Hawk said, trying to sound reassuring. "We're almost there. Just hold on a little longer." The convoy kept moving, the bikers following Hawk's lead, keeping their formation tight as they sped through the mountain roads. Hawk's eyes darted back to the path ahead. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the trees. The fading light made everything feel more isolated, more vulnerable. They couldn't stay in the mountains forever. The cartel would keep coming. The Serpents would regroup. Hawk had no illusions about that. His thoughts were interrupted when Diesel's voice crackled through the radio. "Hawk, we've got company. 2 vehicles heading our way." Hawk's pulse quickened. He glanced in the rearview mirror again, but all he could see were the fading taillights of the convoy behind him. "How far?" he asked, his voice calm but taut with urgency. "About 5 miles back," Diesel replied. "Looks like they're trying to catch up." Hawk's mind raced. The cartel was on their tail, but he wasn't going to let them catch them. Not now. "We're taking the side road," Hawk said, his voice cutting through the radio. "Stay sharp, and don't let them get too close." He signaled to the crew, guiding them off the main road onto a narrow, gravel path that ran alongside the mountain. The road was rough, but it would give them a better chance to lose the pursuit. The convoy swerved, one by one, following Hawk's lead as they veered off the main trail. Jamal's small hands tightened around Hawk's waist as they bounced over the uneven terrain. The boy was scared, but Hawk knew he had to stay focused. They couldn't afford any mistakes. The sound of the pursuing vehicles grew louder as the convoy raced ahead. Hawk pushed his bike harder, his mind focused on the road and the task at hand. The side road was narrow and winding, but would take them deeper into the forest, where the cartel would have a harder time following. The other bikers stayed close behind him, their engines roaring as they powered through the rough terrain. Hawk felt a surge of determination. They were getting out of this. They had to. "Keep going," Hawk said into the radio. "We don't stop until we lose them." The convoy kept moving, pushing the bikes harder as they navigated the twists and turns of the mountain path. Hawk's eyes darted between the road ahead and the mirrors, watching for any sign of the vehicles behind them. He couldn't afford to relax. Not yet. As they pushed forward, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the forest in darkness. The only light came from the headlights of the bikes, cutting through the thick trees, illuminating the narrow road in front of them. Hawk could feel the tension building, the weight of their situation pressing on him. They had to lose the cartel, or they wouldn't make it to safety. Suddenly, Diesel's voice broke through the static again. "Hawk, they're gaining on us. They're not giving up." Hawk cursed, under his breath. They needed to get to higher ground, somewhere they could make a stand, but the road ahead was becoming increasingly treacherous. The path was getting narrower, and the trees were closing in on them. "We need to find a place to hold them off," Hawk said, his voice filled with urgency. He scanned the road ahead, looking for any opportunity. That's when he saw it, a small clearing off to the side of the path. It was the perfect place to set up a defensive position. "There!" Hawk shouted, pointing toward the clearing. "Take the turn. We'll make our stand there." The bikers followed his command, swerving onto a smaller, more hidden path that led into the clearing. Hawk's heart raced as he saw the vehicles coming up fast behind them. They didn't have much time. The convoy reached the clearing, and Hawk immediately stopped his bike, signaling for the others to do the same. The bikes came to a halt, their engines idling as the riders dismounted quickly. Hawk's eyes darted to the trees around them, scanning for any sign of danger. They had to prepare for a fight. The cartel was close, and this was it. There was no more running, no more hiding. They would fight. Hawk turned to Jamal, who was still clutching his back. "Stay close," he ordered. "We're going to get through this. You're safe here. I won't let them take you." The boy nodded, his fears still evident in his eyes. Hawk's heart ached for him, but he couldn't afford to let it show. He had to keep moving forward. They were ready for whatever came next. The clearing was eerily quiet as the convoy of bikers took their positions. The trees stood tall, their branches swaying in the wind, casting long shadows over the ground. Hawk's heart pounded in his chest as he surveyed the area, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The cartel was closing in, and this was their last chance to make a stand. They couldn't afford to lose Jamal now. He glanced at the boy, who was still huddled close to him, looking up with wide, fearful eyes. Hawk gave him a small nod, trying to reassure him despite the gravity of the situation. "Stay behind me, kid," Hawk said, his voice low but firm. "We'll get through this together." Jamal nodded, but the fear in his eyes didn't fade. Hawk's mind raced as he strategized their next move. The clearing was small, and there were limited places to hide. But it was the only option they had. The sound of approaching vehicles was getting louder, the engines roaring in the distance. Hawk could feel the tension mounting in the air. "We need to set up quick," he ordered. "Phantom, take the left side. Diesel, get on the right. Everyone else, take cover and be ready." The bikers quickly scattered into position, their movements coordinated and precise. Hawk stayed close to Jamal, keeping the boy behind him as they crouched down in the shadows. The clearing was their last line of defense. They had to make it count. The sound of the approaching vehicles grew louder, and soon Hawk could make out the headlights in the distance. The cartel was getting closer. Hawk's fingers tightened around the handle of his gun. They were going to need all the firepower they had to make it through this. "Stay low," Hawk whispered to Jamal. "Don't move unless I say so." The boy clung to him, his small body shaking with fear. Hawk wanted to tell him everything would be okay, but he couldn't lie. He didn't know if they were going to make it out alive. The bikes of the cartel's vehicles finally came into view, their headlights cutting through the trees as they approached the clearing. Hawk's heart raced as he counted the number of vehicles. There were at least 3, each one filled with armed men. This wasn't going to be easy. The convoy had to hold their ground. As the vehicles came to a stop at the edge of the clearing, Hawk motioned for the bikers to be ready. The cartel's men stepped out of their trucks, guns in hand, their eyes scanning the area. Hawk could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. They had to act fast. "Now!" Hawk shouted, and the sound of gunfire erupted as the bikers opened fire. The clearing erupted into chaos, the crackle of gunfire filling the air. Hawk moved quickly, staying low as he fired at one of the men, trying to flank them. The cartel's men returned fire, their bullets whizzing past Hawk and the others. The sound of the motorcycle's engines was drowned out by the violence, and Hawk's mind went into overdrive as he scanned the battlefield. He could see Phantom moving silently through the trees, taking out a couple of cartel members with precise shots. Diesel was on the right side, using the cover of the trees to get in close and take out another one of their pursuers. Hawk kept his focus on Jamal, who was crouched behind a large rock, his eyes wide with fear as he watched the chaos unfold. Hawk had to protect him. He couldn't let anything happen to the boy. As the gunfire continued, Hawk darted from cover to cover, using the terrain to his advantage. He could hear the cartel's men shouting, trying to coordinate their attack, but the bikers were relentless. Every shot they fired was calculated, precise. Hawk could see the fear in the cartel's eyes as they realized they were being outgunned. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected the bikers to fight back like this. The fight raged on for what felt like an eternity, but finally, the sound of the cartel's retreating vehicles filled the air. Hawk didn't relax until the last of the vehicles had driven off into the distance. He let out a long breath, his body tense from the adrenaline. The clearing was silent again, except for the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Hawk turned to check on Jamal, who was still crouched behind the rock, his wide eyes filled with relief. "It's over," Hawk said, his voice soft but reassuring. "You're safe." Jamal nodded, still in shock, but the fear in his eyes had started to fade. Hawk moved toward the boy, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We're not out of the woods yet," Hawk said, his voice hardening again. "But we're not going to let them win. Not now, not ever." As the convoy regrouped, the bikers began to check their weapons and equipment. The battle had been fierce, but they had held their ground. Hawk knew it wasn't over, though. This was just the beginning. The cartel wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted, and Hawk wasn't about to let them take Jamal. Not while he still had breath in his body. As the bikers prepared to leave the clearing, Hawk gave one last look around. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. They were ready to fight, and they wouldn't stop until Jamal was safe. The sun was setting as the convoy rode deeper into the mountains. The fight with the cartel had been intense, but it was over for now. Hawk could still hear the sound of his heart pounding in his ears, the adrenaline from the battle still fresh. The trees blurred past as they cut through the winding mountain roads. Hawk glanced back at the convoy, his eyes landing on Jamal, who was still gripping tightly to him. But the boy was quiet now. The fear in his eyes had not gone completely, but there was a sense of relief now. They had won the fight, but Hawk knew that the danger was far from over. The cartel was not a group to back down easily. They would regroup, they would plan, and they would come after them again. And if that wasn't enough, the Serpents were still out there. Hawk pushed the thought aside, focusing on the road ahead. They had to keep moving. They had to find a place where they could regroup, replan, and figure out what to do next. The mountains were remote, isolated, and if they could find the cabin Diesel had mentioned, they might be able to lay low for a while. Hawk's mind was sharp, calculating every possible outcome as they sped through the dense forest. The only sound now was the low rumble of the engines and the occasional snap of a branch under their tires. They were nearly there. "We're close." Diesel's voice crackled through the radio, breaking the silence. "We'll be at the cabin in about 10 minutes. Hawk's grip tightened on the handlebars. He felt a sense of relief wash over him, but it was fleeting. They weren't safe yet. Not until they were behind the walls of that cabin. They had to stay hidden, stay off the grid, and stay sharp. The cartel would be relentless. As they neared the cabin, Hawk could feel Jamal relax a little. The boy's grip on his back loosened, and Hawk saw him glance around at the surroundings. It was clear that Jamal wasn't used to this life. He was just a kid, caught up in something far bigger than him. Hawk couldn't help but feel the weight of his responsibility. He had promised Maya's father he would protect Jamal, and Hawk was not going to let him down. "Almost there." "Kid," Hawk said over his shoulder, his voice low and reassuring. Jamal didn't say anything, but Hawk could feel the tension in the boy's small frame. It wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. The convoy reached the cabin in silence. The place was small, tucked away deep in the woods, and surrounded by tall trees. It was perfect. No one would find them here. For now, at least. The bikers dismounted, their boots crunching on the dry leaves and dirt. Hawk stood still for a moment, scanning the area. It was quiet, too quiet, but Hawk had learned never to trust silence. "Get inside," he ordered. "Everyone set up. We stay here for the night. Keep the lights off and stay low." The bikers moved quickly, securing the area around the cabin. Diesel and Phantom checked the perimeter, making sure no one had followed them. The others began unloading supplies, making sure they had everything they needed for the next few days. Hawk's mind was already working ahead. He knew this wouldn't be their last fight. The cartel would be looking for them, and the Serpents were still out there. They had to make a plan, and fast. Hawk turned to Jamal, who had been standing quietly by the door. The boy's face was still pale, his eyes wide, but he was holding it together. "You good?" Hawk asked. Jamal nodded, but there was no smile on his face. Hawk could see the exhaustion in the boy's eyes, the weight of everything he had gone through. "I'm fine," Jamal whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. Hawk crouched down to the boy's level. "You don't have to be fine. Just hang in there, all right? We're safe for now, and we'll figure out what comes next." Jamal looked up at him, and for the first time, there was a flicker of trust in his eyes. He nodded, but Hawk could see the doubt still lingering in his gaze. Hawk couldn't blame him. He had been through more in the last few days than most people would experience in a lifetime. But they had made it this far. They had survived, and Hawk wasn't about to let anything happen to him now. "Get some rest," Hawk said, standing up and patting Jamal on the shoulder. "We've got work to do tomorrow." As the bikers settled into the cabin, Hawk stepped outside, his eyes scanning the darkened forest. The mountain air was cool, and the quiet was almost deafening. He felt the weight of the responsibility pressing on him again. They weren't safe yet, and Hawk couldn't shake the feeling that something worse was coming. But for now, they had to rest. They had to be ready. The fight wasn't over. Hawk glanced up at the sky, his mind racing. He had made a promise to Jamal's father, and he wasn't going to let that promise go. They were in this together, and together, they would face whatever came next. The night was still as Hawk sat on the porch of the cabin, his gaze fixed on the darkened woods surrounding them. The silence was unsettling. It wasn't the kind of silence that brought peace. It was the kind that hung heavy in the air as if something was about to break it. The bikers had settled in for the night, but Hawk couldn't rest. His mind kept racing, replaying the events of the past few days. The cartel, the Serpents, they weren't just chasing them anymore. They were hunting them, and Hawk knew it wouldn't be long before the next wave of danger arrived. Inside the cabin, the rest of the bikers were quiet too. Even Diesel, who usually kept his cool no matter the situation, was on edge. The reality of what they were facing was starting to sink in. Hawk knew that this wasn't just another run-in with a local gang. This was bigger than that. The cartel had deep roots, and the Serpents were no amateurs. They were playing for keeps, and Hawk couldn't afford to make a mistake. As the last of the daylight faded and the stars took over the sky, Hawk stood up, stretching his sore muscles. He needed to think. They couldn't stay here much longer, but they also couldn't keep running. They needed a plan. He stepped into the cabin, the warm glow of the fire illuminating the room. Jamal was sitting near the fire, his eyes vacant as he stared into the flames. The boy had barely spoken since the fight at the clearing. He had seen too much, and Hawk could see it in his eyes. The fear, the confusion. Jamal wasn't just a child anymore. He had been forced to grow up too fast, thrust into a world of violence and danger. Hawk walked over to him, crouching down to meet his eyes. "Hey, kid," he said softly. Jamal blinked, looking up at him with tired eyes. "You all right?" Hawk asked. Jamal nodded, but his expression was distant. "I'm just tired," he whispered. Hawk nodded, his heart aching for the boy. He couldn't even begin to imagine what Jamal was going through. "I know," Hawk said. "It's a lot, but you're safe here. Well, we're going to figure this out." Jamal didn't answer, but Hawk could see the smallest hint of trust in his eyes. That was something. Hawk stood up and walked over to where Diesel was sitting, his eyes scanning the map spread out in front of him. Diesel looked up when Hawk approached. "What's the plan?" Hawk asked, his voice low. Diesel paused for a moment, studying the maps. "We can't stay here. It's too close to the main road. If the cartel or the Serpents are still out there, they'll find us." Hawk knew Diesel was right. They couldn't risk staying in one place for too long. "So what do you suggest?" Hawk asked. Diesel tapped his finger on the map, pointing to a small, isolated town a few hundred miles to the north. "We head here," Diesel said. "It's remote. No one will expect us to go there." Hawk leaned over, studying the map. The town was small, tucked away in the mountains, and surrounded by dense forest. It seemed like the perfect place to lay low for a while, but Hawk wasn't sure it was enough. "And after that?" he asked. Diesel shrugged. "We regroup, get supplies, and figure out the next step. We can't outrun them forever." Hawk nodded, his mind working quickly. He knew Diesel's plan made sense, but they were dealing with enemies who didn't play by the rules. Hawk had seen enough to know that they couldn't afford to underestimate the cartel or the Serpents. They needed to hit back, but first they had to survive. "All right," Hawk said, straightening up. "We leave in the morning. Everyone get some rest. We move out early." Diesel nodded and turned back to the map, already planning the route. Hawk walked over to the fire and sat down next to Jamal. The boy looked up at him, his face still pale from the stress of everything. "We'll get through this," Hawk said quietly. Jamal didn't say anything, but his eyes softened slightly. Hawk leaned back against the wall, closing his eyes for a moment. The weight of everything was crushing, but he couldn't afford to let it show. Jamal needed him. The bikers needed him. They all depended on him now. Hawk didn't know how long they would be able to run, but one thing was for sure. He wasn't going to stop until Jamal was safe. The night stretched on, and the crackling of the fire was the only sound in the cabin. Outside, the forest was dark and still, but Hawk knew that peace was fleeting. They had made it this far, but the road ahead was only going to get harder. The cartel was still out there, and the Serpents weren't far behind. Hawk ran his hand through his hair and stood up, walking over to the door. He opened it slowly, his eyes scanning the darkness outside. He couldn't see anything, but he could feel the weight of the night pressing in on him. They had to keep moving. They couldn't let their guard down. The cartel wouldn't stop until they had Jamal, and neither would Hawk. He stepped back inside, closing the door behind him. It was time to rest, but Hawk knew that they couldn't afford to be complacent. Tomorrow was another day, and it would bring new challenges. But Hawk was ready. He had made a promise to Maya, and he wasn't going to break it. They would fight, and they would survive. The morning was cold, the sky a muted gray as the convoy of bikers gathered outside the cabin. Hawk stood in front of the door, his eyes scanning the horizon as the others prepared for the next leg of their journey. The night had been long, filled with restless thoughts and the constant awareness that they were far from safe. But now, the time for waiting was over. It was time to act. Hawk's mind was still on the cartel, still on the Serpents, still on Jamal. They had made it this far, but Hawk knew the road ahead was dangerous. There would be no more hiding, no more running. It was time to face what was coming. He turned back to the cabin, where the rest of the bikers were making their final checks, loading up gear, and securing their bikes. Diesel was already on his bike, ready to roll, his face as stoic as always. Phantom and the others were busy with their own preparations, checking their weapons and making sure everything was in place. Jamal, however, stood off to the side, watching everything quietly. Hawk approached him, his footsteps muffled by the crunching gravel beneath his boots. "You good?" Hawk asked softly. Jamal nodded, but Hawk could see the uncertainty in the boy's eyes. "I'm scared," Jamal admitted quietly, his voice trembling. Hawk's heart ached for him. He had seen too much, been through too much for someone so young. But Hawk knew that fear was something they would have to fight together. "I know," Hawk said, crouching down to meet Jamal's gaze. "But we're in this together. We'll keep you safe." Jamal didn't say anything, but his gaze softened just slightly. That was enough for Hawk. It wasn't about making the boy feel safe all the time. It was about showing him that no matter what, Hawk would be there. He stood up and motioned for the others to mount up. "Let's move out. We've got work to do." The convoys started their engines, the low growl of their bikes cutting through the still air. Hawk led the way, the rest of the crew falling into formation behind him. The mountains stretched ahead, their peaks hidden in the mist, as the convoy made its way down the winding road. The air was thick with tension, but Hawk kept his focus on the road ahead. They had a plan. They had to stick to it. They had to find a way to stop the cartel and the Serpents from coming after Jamal. They couldn't keep running forever. As the convoy made their way deeper into the wilderness, Hawk could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him. Every decision he made now could mean life or death. The cartel wasn't going to stop. The Serpents wouldn't stop. But Hawk wasn't about to back down. He had made a promise to Maya, and that promise meant everything to him. They reached a small town on the edge of the mountains, a place Hawk knew would offer them some protection. It was remote, out of sight, and out of mind, exactly what they needed. As they pulled into a small gas station, Hawk looked over at the others. They had made it this far, but it wasn't over yet. "We need to lay low here for a while," Hawk said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "Get supplies, get rest, and make our next move. We can't afford to be seen." The bikers dismounted and began to unload their bikes, moving quickly but with a sense of purpose. Jamal stayed close to Hawk, his small form tucked behind the larger biker. Hawk could feel the boy's fear, but he could also feel the trust beginning to form. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were fighting back. As the bikers gathered around the gas station, Hawk's mind raced with possibilities. They could stay here for a while, but they needed a plan. They couldn't keep running from the cartel and the Serpents. There had to be a way to turn the tide. Diesel walked up to him, his face grim. "What's the next move?" he asked, his voice low. Hawk turned to look at him, his expression hardening. "We take the fight to them," Hawk said firmly. "We don't wait for them to come to us. We find a way to hit them first." Diesel nodded, his eyes narrowing. "You got a plan?" Hawk glanced around at the others. "We will, but we need to get Jamal somewhere safe first. We can't do anything if they still have leverage over him." Diesel studied him for a moment, then nodded again. "Understood." Hawk turned to the rest of the crew. "All right, everyone. We're going to lay low here for a while, but we need to keep our heads down. No contact with the outside world. We can't afford to make any noise right now." The bikers nodded. each one aware of the stakes. They had been through a lot, but the hardest part was yet to come. Hawk looked down at Jamal, who was standing beside him, his small hand holding onto Hawk's leather jacket. Hawk couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility. He had promised to protect this kid, and he wasn't going to let anything happen to him. "You good, kid?" Hawk asked, his voice soft but firm. Jamal nodded, but his face was still filled with uncertainty. Hawk could see the fear in his eyes, but he could also see the trust. And that was enough for Hawk. "We're going to make it through this," Hawk said, giving Jamal's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. Together, the convoy settled in, keeping watch over the gas station and making their plans. Hawk knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long and dangerous, but he was ready. They would fight for Jamal. They would fight for their family. And they would fight until they won.